Between 1963 and 1973, 54 young missionaries from the Calvary Baptist Seminary in rural Kentucky disappeared while traveling to remote villages across Appalachian mountains. Their bodies never recovered. The missing missionaries ranged from 18 to 24 years old. All were described as devout, physically fit, and experienced in wilderness survival. Each carried identical leather satchels containing Bibles, medical supplies, and emergency rations. Search teams found abandoned vehicles at remote trailheads, but no trace of the individuals. Local authorities classified the cases as accidental deaths, despite the absence of bodies or evidence of natural disasters. The Calvary Baptist Seminary stood like a fortress against the rolling hills of eastern Kentucky, its red brick towers visible for miles across the Cumberland Gap. Founded in 1888 by Reverend Thaddeus Moorcock, the institution had earned a reputation as one of America's most rigorous theological training centers. Moorcock believed that true faith required testing through hardship. His philosophy attracted families from across the rural South who sent their sons to be molded into uncompromising servants of God. The seminary's motto, carved in limestone above the main entrance, read, "Through suffering, salvation." By the 1950s, Calvary Baptist Seminary housed over 300 young men between the ages of 16 and 25. The curriculum combined traditional theological studies with intensive physical conditioning. Students woke at 4:30 each morning for prayer, followed by 3 hours of manual labor before breakfast. The seminary operated its own farm, carpentry workshop, and medical clinic. Students learned to build shelters, treat wounds, and survive in wilderness conditions. This practical training distinguished Calvary Baptist from other religious institutions, which focused primarily on academic study. Local newspapers regularly featured stories about the seminary's graduates. Many went on to establish successful churches in remote communities across Appalachia. Others traveled to foreign countries as missionaries, earning recognition for their dedication and resilience in harsh environments. The institution's financial stability impressed church leaders throughout the region. Unlike many struggling rural seminaries, Calvary Baptist maintained modern facilities, well-stocked libraries, and comfortable dormitories. The source of this prosperity remained unclear, as the seminary accepted students regardless of their family's ability to pay tuition. Reverend Moorcock died in 1961, passing leadership to his protege, Dr. Edmund Thorne. Thorne had graduated from Calvary Baptist in 1943 and spent 15 years as a missionary in South America before returning to teach. His appointment received unanimous approval from the seminary's Board of Trustees. Dr. Thorne expanded the institution's outreach programs significantly. He established the Appalachian Mission Project, which sent teams of students to isolated mountain communities lacking regular church services. These missions typically lasted between 1 and 3 weeks, depending on the location's accessibility. The project gained national attention within Baptist circles. Religious publications praised Dr. Thorne's innovative approach to seminary education, which combined classroom learning with practical ministry experience. Donations from supporting churches across the South increased substantially. Seminary records from this period show remarkable enthusiasm among students for mission work. Waiting lists for assignment to remote communities grew longer each semester. Students competed for opportunities to visit the most challenging locations, viewing such assignments as proof of their spiritual maturity. The missions followed a strict protocol. Teams received detailed maps, emergency communication equipment, and supplies for extended stays. Each group included at least one student trained in basic medical procedures. Local authorities were notified of travel plans and expected return dates. Most missions proceeded without incident. Students returned with reports of successful evangelism, new church memberships, and grateful communities. Their stories inspired younger classmates to volunteer for future assignments. The program seemed to fulfill Dr. Thorne's vision of producing fearless, effective ministers. However, a few students began reporting unusual experiences during their missions. They described encounters with hostile locals who seemed to know details about the seminary that hadn't been shared publicly. Some mentioned finding evidence of previous missionary visits to communities that claimed never to have seen outsiders. These reports were dismissed as misunderstandings or exaggerations. Dr. Thorne reminded concerned students that rural communities often possessed oral traditions that could account for such knowledge. He encouraged them to focus on their spiritual objectives rather than dwelling on minor mysteries. The seminary's reputation for producing dedicated missionaries continued to grow. Church leaders from across the region visited Calvary Baptist to observe the training methods. Many expressed interest in replicating the program at their own institutions. Dr. Thorne welcomed these visitors, conducting tours and sharing educational materials. Financial records from the early 1960s show the seminary's income reaching unprecedented levels. Construction began on a new dormitory wing and an expanded library. The institution's Board of Trustees approved salary increases for faculty members and improvements to student dining facilities. Local businesses in the surrounding community prospered from the seminary's growth. Hotels, restaurants, and supply companies all benefited from increased activity. The institution had become central to the region's economy, providing jobs and attracting visitors who spent money in local establishments. The Kentucky Baptist Convention recognized Calvary Baptist Seminary with its highest honor for educational excellence in 1962. Dr. Thorne accepted the award at the annual state convention, delivering a speech about the importance of combining faith with practical service. His remarks emphasized the unique character of Calvary Baptist students. He described them as young men willing to sacrifice comfort and safety for the sake of spreading the gospel. Their commitment to serving in remote, dangerous locations set them apart from graduates of other theological institutions. The audience responded with enthusiasm to Dr. Thorne's presentation. Several ministers approached him afterward, expressing interest in recommending qualified candidates from their congregations. The seminary's enrollment continued to climb, requiring expansion of dormitory facilities and hiring of additional faculty. By 1963, Calvary Baptist Seminary had achieved a level of respect and influence that few similar institutions could match. Its graduates served in leadership positions throughout the Southern Baptist Convention. The Appalachian Mission Project had become a model for other seminaries seeking to provide practical training for their students. Dr. Thorne's leadership had transformed the institution from a regional training center into a nationally recognized educational powerhouse. His vision of producing tough, dedicated ministers seemed to be working perfectly. The seminary's future appeared bright and secure. None of the administrators, faculty, or students realized that within a decade, 54 young men would vanish without a trace while participating in the mission program that had brought the institution such acclaim. The first disappearance occurred on September 15, 1963. James Mitchell, a 22-year-old third-year student from Tennessee, failed to return from a solo mission to Crow's Hollow, a small community nestled deep in the Daniel Boone National Forest. Mitchell had volunteered for the assignment, despite warnings about the area's difficult terrain. Crow's Hollow could only be reached by a narrow mountain trail that wound through dense forest for 12 miles. The community consisted of fewer than 30 residents, most of whom lived in cabins without electricity or telephone service. When Mitchell didn't return by his scheduled date, Dr. Thorne contacted the local sheriff's office. A search team found Mitchell's pickup truck parked at the trailhead, keys still in the ignition. His camping gear and supplies remained untouched in the truck bed. The search expanded over the following week. Volunteers from nearby communities joined professional rescue teams in combing the forest. They found no trace of Mitchell or his equipment. The trail showed no signs of struggle or unusual activity. Residents of Crow's Hollow claimed they had never seen Mitchell. They told searchers that no outsiders had visited their community in recent memory. This contradicted Mitchell's mission plan, which indicated he intended to spend several days conducting religious services for the residents. Dr. Thorne accepted the sheriff's conclusion that Mitchell had become lost while hiking and died from exposure or injury. Memorial services were held at the seminary, where Mitchell was remembered as a dedicated student who had died in service to his faith. The incident might have been forgotten if not for what happened 3 months later. Robert Hayes, a 19-year-old first-year student, vanished while traveling to Pine Ridge, another remote community in eastern Kentucky. Hayes had been assigned to Pine Ridge with a partner, but his teammate fell ill the night before departure. Against normal protocol, Hayes decided to complete the mission alone. He left the seminary on December 8, 1963, driving a borrowed car loaded with Christmas gifts for children in the community. Pine Ridge residents told investigators that Hayes had arrived as scheduled and spent 2 days conducting services. They described him as friendly and enthusiastic. However, they claimed he had left on December 10th, saying he needed to visit another community before returning to the seminary. Hayes never arrived at his alleged destination. His car was found abandoned on a mountain road 20 miles from Pine Ridge, engine still running and driver's door open. Personal belongings remained in the vehicle, including his wallet, watch, and a journal documenting his mission activities. The journal's final entry, dated December 10th, described Hayes's successful work in Pine Ridge and his excitement about extending his mission to help the people Dr. Thorne told me about. No record existed of Dr. Thorne giving Hayes additional assignments or instructions. Sheriff's deputies questioned Dr. Thorne about Hayes's reference to unnamed people. Thorne explained that Hayes was an eager student who sometimes misunderstood casual conversations as formal assignments. He denied giving Hayes any instructions beyond the original Pine Ridge mission. The second disappearance troubled some seminary faculty members. Professor William Garrett, who taught practical theology, questioned whether the mission program needed additional safety protocols. He suggested requiring students to travel in pairs and maintain radio contact with the seminary. Dr. Thorne dismissed these concerns as unnecessary paranoia. He argued that mission work inherently involved risks and that overprotective measures would undermine the program's effectiveness. The Board of Trustees supported his position, noting that only 2 incidents had occurred out of dozens of successful. Spring semester of 1964 proceeded normally. Several students completed missions without incident, returning with positive reports about their experiences. The program's reputation remained strong, and applications for mission assignments continued to exceed available slots. However, doubts began to surface among some students. A few who had completed missions in remote areas reported strange encounters with locals. They described meeting people who claimed to know details about the seminary that seemed impossible for isolated communities to possess. Thomas Brennan, a senior student who had completed 3 missions, confided to roommates about his concerns. He claimed that residents of different communities had made similar comments about Dr. Thorne's boys and their special training. When Brennan asked for clarification, the locals became evasive or hostile. These reports reached Professor Garrett, who began documenting them in private notes. He noticed patterns suggesting that certain remote communities possessed knowledge about the seminary that couldn't be explained by normal communication channels. The isolated nature of these locations made information sharing unlikely. Garrett attempted to discuss his observations with Dr. Thorne during a faculty meeting in May 1964. Thorne became defensive, accusing Garrett of spreading unfounded rumors that could damage the seminary's reputation. He suggested that Garrett's concerns reflected personal anxieties rather than legitimate problems. The exchange created tension between the 2 men that other faculty members noticed. Garrett began keeping his observations to himself, but continued recording details about student reports in a private journal. He hoped to identify patterns that might explain the unusual incidents. Summer missions proceeded without major problems, though several students reported minor mysteries. Maps provided by the seminary sometimes showed trails or landmarks that didn't exist. Community contacts occasionally claimed to have received different information about visit dates or objectives than what students had been told. These discrepancies were attributed to clerical errors or miscommunication. Dr. Thorne's office issued updated maps and contact information, explaining that rapid changes in rural communities sometimes made records outdated. Students were instructed to adapt to local conditions and focus on their spiritual objectives. The third disappearance occurred on August 22, 1964. David Walsh, a 20-year-old second-year student, vanished while returning from a mission to Timber Creek, a community located in a remote valley near the Virginia border. Walsh had completed his assigned mission successfully, spending a week conducting services and providing medical assistance to local residents. He called the seminary on August 21st to report that he was departing Timber Creek and expected to arrive back at school the following evening. When Walsh failed to appear by August 23rd, seminary officials contacted law enforcement. His car was discovered overturned in a ravine 15 miles from Timber Creek. The vehicle showed evidence of having left the road at high speed, but investigators found no explanation for why Walsh would have been driving recklessly. More disturbing was the absence of Walsh's body. The car's interior contained bloodstains but no human remains. Search teams scoured the surrounding area for days without finding any trace of Walsh or his personal effects. Timber Creek residents provided conflicting accounts of Walsh's departure. Some claimed he had left alone, while others insisted he had been accompanied by unidentified men. The community's isolation made verification of these stories impossible, as no outside witnesses were available. Dr. Thorne attended Walsh's memorial service, but offered no explanation for the unusual circumstances surrounding his death. He reminded the congregation that missionary work involved inherent dangers and that faithful servants sometimes paid the ultimate price for their dedication. Professor Garrett's private notes from this period reveal growing alarm about the mission program. He had begun correlating student reports with disappearance locations, identifying several communities that appeared multiple times in concerning accounts. The pattern suggested systematic problems rather than random incidents. 3 disappearances in less than a year exceeded the statistical probability of accidental deaths among a student population of. Garrett calculated that normal attrition rates would predict fewer than 1 death per decade from mission-related activities. His mathematical analysis troubled him deeply. The clustering of incidents around specific remote communities violated probability distributions for random events. Something was causing these disappearances, and it wasn't mere coincidence or natural hazards. Garrett decided to conduct his own investigation of the affected communities. Using vacation time, he traveled to several locations where students had reported unusual encounters. What he discovered would shake his faith in everything he thought he knew about Calvary Baptist Seminary. Professor William Garrett's vacation investigation in September 1964 began with a drive to Hollow Creek, one of the communities mentioned repeatedly in student reports. The settlement appeared on no official maps, accessible only through a series of unmarked logging roads that twisted deep into the Cumberland Mountains. After 3 hours of wrong turns, Garrett found what remained of Hollow Creek. 5 dilapidated cabins surrounded a collapsed church foundation. Weeds grew through broken floorboards, and rusted farm equipment lay scattered across overgrown fields. The place had been abandoned for decades. Local residents in the nearest town told Garrett that Hollow Creek had been deserted since the 1920s, when a mining accident killed most of the adult men. The remaining families had relocated, leaving behind empty buildings that gradually fell into ruin. This information contradicted seminary records showing successful missions to Hollow Creek as recently as 1963. Students had submitted detailed reports describing active communities, religious services, and grateful residents. Either the students were lying, or they had. Garrett's investigation of Pine Ridge yielded similar results. The community existed, but had been inaccessible by vehicle since a bridge collapse in 1959. Residents traveled on foot or horseback to reach the outside world, making it impossible for students to drive there, as mission reports indicated. The discrepancies extended beyond geography. Community leaders in accessible settlements denied ever hosting seminary students. Many claimed they had never heard of Calvary Baptist Seminary, despite detailed mission reports describing extended visits and successful evangelism efforts. Garrett realized that something fundamentally wrong was occurring. Students were departing for legitimate missions, but apparently traveling to different destinations than those documented in their reports. The question was whether they knew about the deception or were victims of it themselves. His investigation took a disturbing turn when he visited the town of Beckley, West Virginia. A local newspaper editor, Harold Mason, remembered publishing an article about missing hikers in 1963. The description matched James Mitchell, the first disappeared student. Mason retrieved the archived article from his file. It described the discovery of camping equipment and personal belongings scattered across a remote area known as Devil's Canyon. Local authorities had concluded that a hiker had been killed by wild animals, though no body was recovered. The article included a photograph of items found at the scene. Garrett recognized Mitchell's distinctive leather Bible case, which students received upon graduation from their first. The case bore the seminary's embossed seal and Mitchell's initials. Mason explained that Devil's Canyon had a reputation for strange disappearances. Over the past decade, several hikers and hunters had vanished in the area. Local residents avoided the region, claiming it was cursed or haunted by malevolent spirits. Garrett pressed for more specific information about the disappeared individuals. Mason consulted his records and provided a shocking revelation. Between 1960 and 1964, 12 people had vanished in or near Devil's Canyon. All were young men between 18 and 25 years old. The pattern matched the seminary's missing students perfectly. Garrett requested copies of all articles about Devil's Canyon disappearances. Mason agreed, but warned that the subject made local residents uncomfortable. Previous journalists who had investigated the mystery had faced hostility from the community. Garrett returned to Kentucky with Mason's files and spent days cross-referencing dates and descriptions. The evidence suggested that seminary students weren't disappearing during legitimate missions. They were being directed to a specific location where something terrible was happening to them. His research was interrupted by news of the fourth disappearance. Mark Stevens, a 23-year-old senior student, had vanished while traveling to Copper Falls, allegedly located in southwestern Virginia. Stevens had been scheduled to return on September 30th, but never arrived. Garrett immediately checked topographical maps and discovered that no community named Copper Falls existed in the specified area. The coordinates provided in Stevens's mission assignment led to uninhabited forest land within the Jefferson National Forest. This discovery prompted Garrett to examine all mission assignments more carefully. He found that approximately 30% of assigned destinations either didn't exist or were inaccessible by the routes provided to students. The pattern had been obscured by successful missions to legitimate communities. Garrett realized that Dr. Thorne was deliberately sending certain students to false destinations. The selection criteria weren't obvious, but victims shared certain characteristics. All were physically fit, academically successful, and highly regarded by faculty members. More disturbing was the discovery that Dr. Thorne personally selected students for missions to non-existent communities. Normal assignments were handled by the seminary's administrative staff, but the problematic missions all bore Dr. Thorne's direct authorization. Garrett decided to confront Dr. Thorne with his findings. On October 15, 1964, he requested a private meeting in Thorne's office. The conversation that followed would haunt Garrett for the rest of his life. Dr. Thorne listened calmly as Garrett presented his evidence. When the presentation concluded, Thorne smiled and congratulated Garrett on his thoroughness. He then revealed information that shattered Garrett's understanding of everything he thought he knew about the seminary. The Calvary Baptist Seminary serves purposes beyond theological education, Thorne explained. We've been conducting important research for the past several years. Certain government agencies require young men with specific qualities for classified projects. Thorne described a partnership between the seminary and unnamed federal organizations. Selected students were recruited for covert operations requiring individuals with strong moral convictions, physical fitness, and minimal family connections that might complicate their disappearance. The mission program provided perfect cover for recruitment. Students believed they were serving God when they were actually being evaluated for government service. Those who met selection criteria were offered opportunities to serve their country in ways that required complete secrecy. Garrett asked what happened to students who didn't volunteer for these opportunities. Thorne's expression darkened as he explained that some individuals posed security risks due to their knowledge of the selection process. Such cases required more permanent solutions. The missing students aren't dead, Thorne claimed. They're serving in classified positions that require them to abandon their previous identities. Their families believe they died in accidents, but they're actually performing vital services for national security. Garrett demanded proof of these claims. Thorne opened a filing cabinet and retrieved a folder containing photographs and documents. The material showed several missing students in military uniforms, apparently alive and healthy in unknown locations. However, other documents in the folder told a different story. Medical examiner reports described autopsies performed on unidentified young men whose descriptions matched missing students. The reports were stamped with official seals from various government agencies. Thorne explained that some recruits didn't survive the training required for their new roles. Others proved unsuitable for classified work and had to be eliminated to protect operational security. The program accepted these casualties as necessary costs of national defense. Garrett realized he was looking at evidence of systematic murder disguised as patriotic service. The seminary was operating as a recruitment center for programs that killed young men whose only crime was possessing qualities that made them valuable to government agencies. Thorne offered Garrett a choice. He could join the program as a faculty advisor, receiving substantial compensation for his silence and cooperation. Alternatively, he could suffer the same fate as students who posed security risks to the operation. Garrett asked for time to consider the offer. Thorne agreed, but warned that the decision couldn't be delayed indefinitely. Too many people were asking questions about the missing students, and the program's continued success required absolute secrecy from all participants. That night, Garrett sat in his office considering his options. He could expose the truth and likely be killed before anyone believed his story. He could join the conspiracy and become complicit in the murder of his own students. Or he could disappear and hope to survive long enough to find help. He chose a fourth option. Garrett spent the night copying documents from his investigation and preparing a detailed written account of his discoveries. He sealed these materials in an envelope addressed to Harold Mason, the West Virginia newspaper editor, who had helped him uncover the truth. The package was mailed the following morning from a post office in a distant town. Garrett then returned to the seminary and informed Dr. Thorne of his decision to cooperate with the program. He hoped this deception would buy time for Mason to receive the evidence and take appropriate action. For the next 6 months, Garrett played the role of willing collaborator while secretly documenting additional crimes. He learned that the program had expanded beyond Calvary Baptist Seminary to include similar operations at other religious institutions across the South. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Hundreds of young men had been recruited, killed, or disappeared through fake mission programs at multiple seminaries. Government agencies were using religious institutions to identify and eliminate individuals who might threaten national security in undefined ways. Garrett's investigation revealed that Dr. Thorne wasn't the program's originator. He was following orders from officials whose identities remained classified. The seminary was just one component of a larger operation designed to monitor and control potential dissidents within religious communities. By spring 1965, Garrett had documented evidence of at least 30 murders connected to the Calvary Baptist program alone. His secret files included photographs, financial records, and transcripts of conversations with Dr. Thorne that revealed the systematic nature of the crimes. On May 12, 1965, Professor William Garrett failed to appear for his scheduled classes. His office had been cleaned out overnight, and all his personal belongings had disappeared. Dr. Thorne announced that Garrett had accepted a position at another institution and left without notice. Harold Mason received Garrett's package in late May 1960. The contents horrified him, but he lacked sufficient credibility to expose such an enormous conspiracy. Mason decided to investigate independently, hoping to corroborate Garrett's claims with additional evidence. Mason's investigation ended abruptly when his newspaper office burned down on June 3, 1965. The fire destroyed all his files, including Garrett's documentation about the seminary murders. Mason himself died in the blaze, officially ruled an electrical accident by local authorities. The disappearances continued with methodical precision through the remainder of the 1960s. Seminary records show that between 1965 and 1970, 28 additional students vanished during mission assignments. Each case followed the same pattern: departure for a remote community, failure to return, and discovery of abandoned vehicles with no trace of the occupants. Dr. Thorne refined the selection process to minimize suspicion. Students were chosen from different class years and geographic backgrounds to avoid obvious patterns. Mission assignments were spaced months apart, preventing clusters of disappearances that might attract unwanted attention from law enforcement or media. The seminary's Board of Trustees never questioned the increasing casualty rate among missionaries. Minutes from board meetings during this period reveal acceptance of Dr. Thorne's explanations about the inherent dangers of missionary work in remote Appalachian communities. Financial records from the late 1960s show substantial payments to the seminary from unidentified sources. These funds were classified as educational grants and research stipends, but their origin and purpose remained deliberately obscured in official documentation. Local law enforcement agencies gradually stopped investigating disappearances of seminary students. Sheriff's departments in multiple counties received instructions from state authorities to classify such cases as accidental deaths and limit search efforts to 48 hours. The Kentucky State Police established a special protocol for handling missing seminary students. Officers were instructed to file reports with designated supervisors who forwarded information to unspecified federal agencies. Local investigators were discouraged from pursuing independent leads or questioning seminary officials. By 1970, the program had achieved a level of operational security that made exposure virtually impossible. Students, faculty, and administrators who might have questioned the unusual pattern of disappearances had either been recruited into the conspiracy or eliminated as security risks. The final documented disappearance occurred on October 31, 1973. Timothy Walsh, younger brother of previously vanished student David Walsh, failed to return from a mission to Bear Creek Hollow. His disappearance marked the end of the most active phase of the program. Seminary enrollment had begun declining in the early 1970s as word spread through Baptist communities about the high casualty rate among Calvary Baptist students. Parents became reluctant to send their sons to an institution where mission work seemed unusually dangerous. Dr. Thorne announced his retirement in June 1974, citing health concerns and a desire to pursue private consulting work. He was replaced by Dr. Marcus Webb, a seminary graduate who had spent the previous decade serving as a military chaplain. Under Webb's leadership, the mission program was dramatically scaled back. Students were no longer sent to remote communities without established church contacts. All missions required prior coordination with local law enforcement and regular communication with seminary officials. The changes came too late for the 54 young men who had vanished during Dr. Thorne's administration. Their families continued to believe that their sons had died in accidents while serving God in dangerous wilderness areas. Official records maintained this fiction through careful manipulation of evidence and witness testimony. Death certificates were issued for students whose bodies were never recovered, allowing families to collect life insurance benefits and achieve some measure of closure. The true nature of the Calvary Baptist program remained classified information accessible only to individuals with the highest levels of government security clearance. Even these officials received limited details about operational methods and objectives. Dr. Thorne's retirement location was never disclosed publicly. Seminary alumni who attempted to contact him received responses indicating that he had moved to an undisclosed location for health reasons. No forwarding address or contact information was. Government agencies involved in the program began destroying records in the mid-1970s as public skepticism about federal operations increased following Watergate revelations. Documents related to the seminary project were incinerated or shredded to prevent potential exposure. The few surviving files were reclassified at higher security levels and stored in facilities accessible only to personnel with specialized clearances. Access logs indicate that these materials have been reviewed fewer than a dozen times since 1980. Calvary Baptist Seminary closed permanently in 1978 due to declining enrollment and financial difficulties. The property was sold to a private development company that demolished most buildings and converted the land into a residential subdivision. The seminary's library and archives were donated to the Kentucky Baptist Convention, which stored the materials in a warehouse facility. However, a fire in 1982 destroyed most of these records, eliminating potential evidence about the mission program and student disappearances. Families of the vanished students occasionally attempted to reopen investigations into their sons' deaths. These efforts were consistently frustrated by missing evidence, uncooperative witnesses, and jurisdictional disputes between various law enforcement agencies. Several former students who had participated in missions to legitimate communities reported strange experiences to investigators. They described encounters with individuals who claimed to represent government agencies and warned them against discussing their seminary experiences with outsiders. These witnesses often recanted their statements after experiencing various forms of intimidation. Some lost their jobs or faced financial difficulties that forced them to relocate to distant communities. Others simply stopped cooperating with investigators without explanation. The few journalists who attempted to investigate the Calvary Baptist disappearances faced similar obstacles. Sources became unavailable, documents disappeared from public records, and editors killed stories citing legal concerns about unsubstantiated allegations against government agencies. Harold Mason's nephew, Robert Mason, inherited his uncle's newspaper in 1975 and discovered references to the seminary investigation in personal papers that survived the 1965 fire. Robert attempted to resume the investigation, but was warned by federal agents that pursuing the story would result in criminal charges for interfering with national security operations. By 1980, most individuals with direct knowledge of the Calvary Baptist program had either died or been silenced through various means. The conspiracy had achieved the complete suppression of information about its activities through systematic elimination of witnesses and evidence. The families of vanished students grew old and died without learning the truth about their sons' fates. Cemetery headstones across the South mark the graves of young men whose bodies were never recovered, memorializing victims of crimes that officially never occurred. Contemporary law enforcement databases contain no references to the Calvary Baptist disappearances. The cases were expunged from official records during the 1980s as part of broader efforts to eliminate traces of classified government programs from public documentation. The residential subdivision built on the former seminary property shows no indication of its previous use. Street names like Faith Circle and Seminary Drive provide subtle hints about the area's history, but most residents remain unaware of the institution's dark legacy. Occasionally, hikers in remote areas of eastern Kentucky discover items that might have belonged to the vanished students. Rusted camping equipment, damaged Bibles, and personal effects surface periodically in locations far from established trails or communities. These discoveries are typically reported to local authorities, who classify them as abandoned property and dispose of them according to standard protocols. No attempts are made to connect such items with unsolved disappearances from decades earlier. The true extent of the Calvary Baptist program remains unknown. Government records that might reveal additional victims or operational details continue to be classified at the highest levels of national security. Freedom of Information Act requests are routinely denied on grounds of ongoing national security concerns. Dr. Edmund Thorne died in 1987 at an undisclosed location. His obituary appeared in a small newspaper in rural Montana, identifying him as a retired educator who had requested a private burial with no public services. No mention was made of his connection to Calvary Baptist Seminary. The 54 young men who vanished between 1963 and 1973 remain officially listed as victims of accidental deaths during missionary activities. Their names appear on a memorial plaque at the Kentucky Baptist Convention headquarters, honoring them as martyrs who died serving God in remote wilderness areas. The plaque provides no details about the circumstances of their deaths or the institution they attended. Visitors who inquire about the memorial receive brief explanations about the dangers faced by missionaries working in isolated communities during the 1960s and 1970s. No investigation has ever been conducted into the systematic nature of the disappearances or the possibility that they resulted from criminal activity rather than accidents. The cases remain closed in law enforcement files. with no provision for reopening them based on new evidence or testimony. The truth about what happened to those 54 young missionaries died with the men who orchestrated their disappearances. Their voices were silenced forever in the remote mountains of eastern Kentucky, where their faith led them into darkness. If this story reached you, if you stayed until the very end, it's because something inside recognizes that truth has a way of surfacing, even when powerful forces try to bury it forever. These 54 young men believed they were answering God's call. Instead, they walked into a nightmare that consumed them completely, leaving behind only questions that will never be answered and families that never learned the truth. Leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to know how far these forgotten stories are traveling and whether anyone else remembers whispers about places like Calvary Baptist Seminary. And consider subscribing to this channel. There are more stories like this one, institutions that wore masks of respectability while committing unspeakable acts, cases that were buried so deep that most people forgot they ever happened. But we haven't forgotten, and we won't let you forget either.